Welcome to episode 32 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning speaking to you from my house here in southeast London. The sun is out. Well, it's not, it's gone down actually, it's night here. I'm trying to get another podcast out for August 2021, and that means staying up late. Everyone else is in bed, and I'm talking a little bit softer than usual into my microphone here in my little office. I hope you enjoyed episodes 30 and 31, in which I spoke to the legendary Walter Murch. Thanks for all the feedback. Walter even got in touch to say how pleased he was about the episodes, adding that they were well presented. I couldn't be more happy about that, to be honest with you. Hopefully I can speak to Walter again next year in time for the release of his new book, which I'm very excited about. Well done to Peter Hearn for winning the stack of John Patrick Shanley and Walter Murch and dice. They are on the way to you. Keep an eye on Twitter at JamieSWB. That used to stand for Star Wars Begins, which was my Star Wars filmumentary. But keep an eye on that account for more competitions coming in the future. For this episode, here in August 2021, you'll hear my conversation with director and writer John Patrick Shanley. Predominantly a writer for the stage, John also wrote and directed the much-loved 1990 romantic comedy fantasy, I guess, Joe versus the Volcano, starring Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. So many people love this movie, and if they love it, they really love it. Yes, I'm thinking of you, Jim Maxwell, and Jason Henry. Oh, and I should shout out to one of my top listeners, Ryan Henry, brother of Jason. Thanks, Ryan, for your support as well. It's very much appreciated. So John Patrick Shanley went on to win the Oscar for Moonstruck and received a ton of acclaim with the film Doubt, which he wrote and directed. If any of these films are new to you, by the way, do check them out, either before or after you listen to the podcast. It doesn't really matter, but do watch them. You can consider it your homework for this week, for this episode. So here's my conversation with John Patrick Shanley, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. Oh, and one more thing. A big thank you to Jim Maxwell, former guest on the podcast and friend now, for putting me in touch with John Patrick Shanley. As I often do, I often ask my guests, who do you think might be worth getting on the podcast? And John was a friend of Jim's, and Jim kindly put me in touch. And within moments, I got an email from John saying, yeah, let's do it. So thanks to Jim, and thanks always for your support, mate, as well. It does mean a lot. John, I'm always fascinated by creatively gifted people and the beginning of their imaginative lives. When did you first become aware that you had a creative mind and that it wasn't perhaps typical of those around you?
Well, I think the fact of it came well before the realization of it. So I was writing from the time that I was 10 years old. And before that, when I was 5, I was thrown out of school for intense daydreaming. So I basically have been doing this right along. And then after I've been writing for several, I would say 3 years, maybe I was 13, I started to say that I was a poet. And from then on, my identity became more and more fixed as a writer, and to this very day.
And did you always see the kind of line that you wanted to take? You said you started out and you called yourself a poet. Did you then feel like the next step was writing, and maybe then into theatre and then into film? Or was it just something that kind of happened along the way?
I had no sense of future whatsoever. So I was doing what I was doing because that's what I did. And I am still doing what I do because that's what I do.
And what stopped you from being a poet then? What was the moment when you realised this isn't for me and I'm going to move on to another creative world?
Well, a couple of things. One time I was invited to a party and the hostess lit up when she answered the door and it was me. And she said, "Oh my God, John, you're a poet. There's a poet here. I can't wait to introduce you." And she took me through this fabulous party and one fantastic person after another to the one miserable son of a bitch in the far corner. And that's when I was like, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to hang out with that guy. I'm at the show. That was one kind of thing. The other and bigger reason is that I never gave up poetry. I simply found the proper forum so that people would be able to sit back in their chairs and listen to language for a significant period of time, which they're much less prone to do when you call it poetry and more prone to do when you call it a play.
I've often talked to my guests about mentors in their life, mentors being a big, important part of people in the creative industries. Did you have a mentor or mentors that you look to and still think of to this day?
I have people that were influential in some way. Probably the first one was a guy in the private school that I went to in New Hampshire when I was 15, and he was a serial child abuser. He never abused me, but a lot of people around me, which I did not know at the time, but I found out later. And that creates a very interesting moral universe to live in, because it's sort of like getting a scholarship from Hitler. And people say, how about that Adolf Hitler? And you say, well, I don't know. He was always good to me. And so I'm sure there were, some people who were treated very well by Hitler. And then, what do you do? What do I do with the information that this guy was a soul-destroying pedophile? What happens is you end up with having to live in the conflict of opposites from an early point in your life. Nobody that was influential in my life after that had that kind of deeply damaged resume. But I had a teacher in first year of college who was somebody that I looked up to as an English literature guy, and we're still friends to this day. And in fact, I'll be going on vacation with him this summer at a certain point. He survived COVID. He was on a ventilator for a month. He's 84, but he's an ex-Marine and he made it through. So then, later on, I got, more celebrated people who were in my corner and sort of giving me some advice or guidance or interaction, like Norman Jewison and Mike Nichols and Steven Spielberg and Kathy Kennedy and Frank Marshall. And these people were just stellar human beings and have, gave me some good tips along the way. Bill Goldman was a close friend. So you gather, as much as anything, it's good once you're going through the mill to talk to people who have been through the mill.
Yeah.
That's what's really good. So when you're having a bad day, they've had the bad day you're having. And they can both commiserate and maybe give you some good advice.
Yeah, I can certainly see those people have definitely been through all those experiences, particularly those Hollywood people you mentioned there. So when did you realize that, or what was it that made you realize that you could write about what was around you?
I guess I always was writing about either what was around me or to escape what was around me. And more often the latter. I think that one of the earmarks of a certain kind of creative person is the easiness with which they get bored. And that boredom, I encounter boredom as aggression. That if somebody's boring me, I believe they are doing that to me, and that it's a hostile act that must be counted in some way. either by checking out into some imaginative landscape or by turning the situation into a confrontation where the boring person is no longer allowed to be boring. And that can be done by just confronting them about the emptiness of their life.
I'll watch out for that one. I'm looking at my questions here going, shit.
You know, if you go somewhere when you're bored. That's sort of the nature. Boredom is a door and a route that, it's an arrow pointing like you must walk away from this towards something else because you're not getting anything from this. And it's a search for sustenance in the desert. So I should be grateful to all the people who bored me, but I'm not.
Yeah, I'm very aware that my kids need to be bored for their minds to open up. Dad, can I have the iPad in the car for the 5-hour journey? No, you can't. I want you to look out the window and I want you to dream, because that's where imagination and ideas come from. Absolutely.
Wow, you're like a nightmare dad.
Oh, yeah, I am. Oh, don't get me wrong. Sometimes I say, okay. You had success in the theatre pretty young, John, and what kind of pressure does that put on you, and how does it continue to drive you for projects that are ahead? Because they could well be a failure, that your next thing could well be a failure. How did that feel?
Well, most of the time you fail. I guess, I did a play at a small black theater in New York called the Urban Arts Corps, which was run by Vinette Carroll, who was a big deal black director on Broadway. Did Arms Too Short, To Box with God, and Don't Bother Me, I Can't Cope. And she basically stood alone. There was nobody, I can't think of anybody else, a black woman who had those kind of credentials. But she had a little theater called the Urban Arts Corps. And I wrote a play about my time in the Marine Corps called Saturday Night at the War. And it had an interracial cast, and they produced it. And people thought I was a black playwright. The audience, that audience was truly integrated, and which I found thrilling. And they were used to talking back and being demonstrative as an audience. And I sorely missed that for the following 10 years when I wasn't working in a black theater. But the production went really well, and nobody reviewed it. Nobody came. It's this little bitty theater, and just nobody came. Audiences came, but not critics. And I got one review. It was good. It was in some paper that existed for 1 year or something, and that was it. And that, which I didn't know, was going to be my last good play and or production for 10 years. So then after that, I wrote play after play. Nothing came of it. I got a production about once every year and a half from somebody. I made an average of $75 a year from playwriting. Then after 10 years, I did Dandy in the Deep Blue Sea. And that made a big splash. But it was a commercial run, and as a commercial run, it failed. It was like only around for like 2 months, and I made a total of $5,000. But I felt like I made enough of a splash where I turned a corner. And then I wrote my next play, Savage in Limbo, and no one would do it. And that's when I learned, it's like, yeah, the past doesn't matter. When it comes to theater, it's now. And what's more, because I like Savage Limbo to this day, only one group of 3 people who had just gotten out of Yale and started a theater came to me and said, "Oh, we'd like to do this play." And nobody else, nobody had the slightest interest in it. And so there was no momentum that you built up from a success. You were starting at square one. And then we did Savage in Limbo, both up at Vassar and in New York. And for the most part, the reviews weren't good. But what was going on in the four walls of theater was thrilling. It was fabulous production, and audiences were responding in kind. And I knew from then, I'm like, well, I'm gonna be able to do this. I don't care what they're writing or not writing about it. I'm gonna be able to do this. And I did my next play, The Dreamer Examines His Pillow. Same deal. Press, nothing. And audiences, wow. And then about that time, I started to do film for the first time, because I wasn't making any money at all, and literally couldn't pay my rent. And so I decided to write a screenplay, and I read a bunch of screenplays. And then I just sat down and watched some movies and said, how would I write this? I watch a James Bond movie and say, how would I write this down? Forget what I think of it. How do you do it? And then I read a screenplay, and I was like, oh, I get it. It was Scarface, Oliver Stone. I hadn't come out yet, but I read it and I thought the prose was really purple. And then I thought, would you think it was purple if you were seeing it rather than reading it? And I was like, no. And that's when I thought, oh, I get it. I get how you have to do this. You got to describe the experience of seeing the film, not as a piece of literature, but as a moviegoer. And somehow that worked. And I wrote a screenplay called Five Corners about my neighborhood when I was growing up. And it took a year, but it got made. George Harrison, the Beatle, put up the money for it. And away we went. And we wrapped shooting. And 1 week after we wrapped shooting Five Corners, we started shooting Moonstruck, which was my second screenplay. And when Moonstruck came, Five Corners came and went. Nobody saw it until it came out on video cassette. And then people liked it once it came out on video cassette, but nobody saw it, the first one. And then Moonstruck came out as a big hit. Again, got like a 100% negative review from the New York Times. Everything I did got a negative review from the New York Times. And then, and the basis of the criticism was that this is not what Italian-American people are really like. And then the movie went to #1 in Rome. And New York Times wrote a second review and said it was a classic and never mentioned the first review again. And I was like, this is the way the world works. And about that time, I did a play called Italian-American Reconciliation. And lo and behold, they started to think my plays were good after I was a success. So that told me a lot. Elizabeth Taylor said, there's no perfume like success. And I think she was right.
Yeah, it certainly seems to count for more in the film industry than it does in the theatre. Like, as you said, in the theatre you can just keep going and you can make these small productions. But with movies, it feels like you've got maybe 2 chances at best, and then you're kind of gone if you don't. I mean,
yeah, I guess maybe, you just look. Everybody who does this, if they do it long term, film, television, theater, you spend about 3/4 of your time scheming how to keep from being thrown out of the whole thing. Because, there's an endless amount of competition, and you got to really be thinking on your feet, and you've got to be scheming. I wrote Moonstruck as much as anything because I looked around and I went, okay, the way you get a movie made is you get a movie star to be in your movie. I thought, well, everybody's after these same 6 guys. And there's all of these really famous women. And they all do nothing but say, we can't find any material. And if the price is right, if the movie doesn't cost that much to make, if you get one of those people, you're going to get the movie made. So I'm like, that's no brainer. I'm writing, my lead is going to be a female, and here we go. And I wrote Moonstruck. And it turned out to be true. We got Cher.
Yeah, it really feels like you captured lightning in a bottle there with Cher and Nicolas Cage. And I watched it again recently. It's a film that I've always enjoyed, and the energy on the screen is great. Your writing's fantastic. Jewison's direction just keeps things moving along.
And he did a great job. We had a very similar sense of humor on that film.
In the theatre, obviously the writer sort of has power over the whole thing, right? Whereas in film, the director seems to have the power over the writer. How does that dynamic work for you then when you're the writer and you have a director on board?
I've never had, it's never been about power for me. Certainly it can be. But actually I did one show where it was about power. The director was an asshole and talented, did a good job, but he was an asshole and replaced me simply as a matter of ego. The guy who came in after me told him, "Why would you touch this? This is really good." And he just changed a couple of things just so he could feel like it wasn't mine. It was as simple as that. It was territorial. But other than that one time, and that was a feature, but it was a feature for HBO called Live from Baghdad. Other than that one time, and I was very happy with the final product, it's never been about power. It's the best idea in the room. Film and theater, these are collaborative arts, and it takes everybody having their best day to survive.
Yeah, I've got a friend who's in the theatre here in London, and he talks about the difference between theatre and film. He likes to be able to refine his performance in a theatre environment, through rehearsals and through performance and through the matinee. And he said with film, you kind of have, sometimes you have one, maybe two goes at it. Do you find that a frustration in the film side of things?
No. I have found the actors that I've worked with have been unbelievably well prepared. In terms of, my last film I did, Wild Mountain Thyme, I would have liked to have given Chris Walken more time with a dialect coach than we had. But other than that, he was incredibly well prepared. All of the actors were Jamie Dornan and Emily Blunt, John Hamm. They come in, it's like hiring gunslingers. They come in and you're like, blow the eye out of this guy's sign, and they'll be like, boom, and they do it, Yeah. So they work very hard behind the scenes. It's very different than theater. In theater, actors sometimes show up like, so what play are we doing? They have no, they come, some American actors especially, they come like, yeah, so, okay, so, and they're like they never saw the script in their lives. And that's not a universal, like Cherry Jones showed up, full-blown performance day one of rehearsal. She had the character, she had the whole thing going on. But it's more often than not the other way, where they come in and it's like they're disoriented. Like, is this the right address? And in film, you just never see that. This is it, man. They are going for it. They know they got a very brief window to get it right. And there's no way they're going to be ill prepared on the day.
Mm. Do your creativity, you talked about how you kind of analysed what a screenplay is and how to do a screenplay, so you clearly have that sort of analytical mind as well. But how do you get into your kind of creative mode? I spoke to a guy recently who designs a lot of the opening sequences for movies, Dan Perry. He did Taxi Driver, he did Warriors, he did Star Wars. And he says that his ideas become fully formed and he has to scramble to write them down. Otherwise they're gone. How do you invite your ideas in?
Well, a lot of different ways. For a long time, when I was doing a play, I would start by designing the set. I would just write a description of the set over and over again, keep improving it. and I wouldn't let anybody come into it. I'd keep the characters out as long as I could. And then one day I'd say, all right, come on. And the play would start. So that was a way. I've just completed a play last week, and I was writing the play, and I was about halfway through, 2/3 of the way through, and I went for a walk, and suddenly I saw this character walk into the play, and I went, wow, never saw that coming. And which thrilled me because, and I'm like, it makes sense that this person would show up, but I never dreamed of it. And then it came into my head, and I knew that the audience would have that experience too, that they would go like, oh shit, oh yeah, that does make sense, but never saw that coming. And when I did Doubt, I wouldn't write the play. I kept it, I'm going to write a play about these nuns. First, I just had the title. I'm like, I want to write a play called Doubt. And the guy I said it to said, what's it about? And I said, that's all I got. I just know I want to write that play. And then I thought, I'll make it about the nuns that I had when I was a kid. And I thought, okay, and then it'll be a thing about the priest, and suspicions about the priest. Well, I still wouldn't start the play. And then I saw the Black Mother walk in, and I'm like, now it's a play. And then and only then would I write it. So in different ways, it's sort of creating an environment, sometimes a significant piece of the story, and then the element that I never suspected showing up, or the element that I did suspect finally showing up. So in other words, when I do the set, is that I let the characters come in. When I do it from the point of view of telling the story in a kind of non-event way, and then finding the event that pulls it all together, takes it to another level. If I find that, that's a thrilling moment for me.
I bet. And it sounds like, in a sense, you have to always have a foot in the world of the audience member. You have to kind of be surprised by your ideas, as an audience member would. As you said, as that character walks in, they're going to go, oh shit. You have to have a foot in that camp.
I was surprised. Yeah, I was writing it, and I was surprised. So, that's when you really hit on something. And that's a great feeling.
You've said before, I think in one interview I heard you say about film and theatre cross-pollinating each other. Mm-hmm. I can kind of see how theatre pollinates film, but how does it work in the other direction? How does film pollinate back into theatre, do you think?
Well, I mean, for me, it's, two very different ways of thinking with something underneath that's the same. So, the thinking primarily visually when you're in film can help you to come up with a couple of visual things when you go back into the theater. And whether I'm working in film or theater, a thing that I've come to find important is I have to tie my background and foreground together. My foreground plays can be all foreground. I need to tie it into the physical environment that is supporting it. Can't just walk through like as a doctor in a hospital talking about life. He's got to perform the duties of the quotidian task of being in a hospital, and that brings a level of realism to it, both for the actor and for the audience, that takes it to another level. In film, you're shooting on a minimum 3 planes. There's the space in between you and the actor, there's the actor, and then there's the environment behind the actor. And at its best, you're using all of them. And so, very often in film, you'll see like the actor's talking and he walks basically behind a potted plant. And you're like, Why do you walk behind a potted plant? You actually don't think that. You like it because that's more the experience. You don't get unleavened by breaks in perception, another human being. You sort of pick them up, catch as catch can, in their environment as you can manage it. The recreation of that experience on film, if you're Tony Scott and you're just like smoking up the set as much as you can to create something between the figure and the camera. There was an era of cinematography where all of the cameramen flashed their film. They exposed the film to a low level of light before they shot because that gave them some distance from the material. When you see like a soap opera, very often there's a level of realism that interferes with your ability to experience the story with the suspension of disbelief in place. You need a little feeling of once upon a time, that it isn't quite here, it isn't quite now, that you're getting to go somewhere. And of course, the other thing about film is that you have to ask yourself the question, as an audience member, you go like, well, what am I curious about? What don't I get to see in my life walking around? Because I said, well, do you get to see gangsters shooting up houses? It's like, no, not usually. Do you get to see other people having sex? No, not usually. You get, do you get to see the secret crimes of people? No, not usually. Or it could be as simple as I saw a trailer one time. I was in a movie theater a million years ago, and this trailer came on. I'm like living in New York City, right? And it's out in the American West in like the 19th century. And it's just a lot of nature going on, a lot of space. And it was this movie, Dances with Wolves. And I'm like, I want to see that. And it was simple as, I live in the city. I want to get out of here for a couple hours. And that, you have to, kind of ask yourself those kinds of questions about what do I want in an unselfish way, I mean, right now, man, everybody's having escape fantasies, but they don't know where to go, even in their dreams, to escape the ever deepening sense of crisis that the world is offering us at the moment. It will be, and movies, of course, have responded by like everything is completely off the charts, has nothing to do with the world as it is. So, everybody's like a superhero and have origin stories, and they like do multiple tent poles about, some fantastical character because it's unbearable to just be trapped here on Earth right now for so many people.
I was thinking, in your films, there's sometimes they can get criticized because they've got this melodramatic kind of people, you have large characters. I can think of Moonstruck. There's a lot of character, there's a lot of power behind those performances. And I think some people say, well, that's not real, I don't believe in that. But I also think that, as you just said, film offers us some escapism, and also there are people in the world like that, and I think they can be celebrated too, right?
I think that there's a lot of people in the world like that. I think people are in denial about their true natures, and I'm certainly like that. I've never written any of these characters where I didn't feel like I was that character, or at least for the length of time it took me to write it. And I've felt trapped. I've felt exhilarated. I've felt in love to the point where I would destroy myself to achieve a moment of happiness in that far-flung fantasy of perfect happiness with another human being. I've been to the opera in every sense of the word. And the opera comes from somewhere. You know, this is a life and death struggle being alive. The stakes are that high all the time. You never, and you know, you walk along and you're like, well, you know, I'm kind of an ordinary guy, or it's kind of a boring life, or whatever. It's like you are walking on a razor blade over flames. And you occasionally convince yourself it is not so, because it's too upsetting to realize what your life actually is. And then, you know, you get a call from a doctor who says, you know, we got the results of your test and I think you need to come in. And suddenly all that complacency evaporates, replaced by a very different kind of person who you contain. Just take somebody who's like standing by the ledge of a tall building and it loses their balance for a minute, and see the change that comes over their face when they realize, oh, this could be it. Suddenly they're very awake and everything's very important.
Sticking with Moonstruck, because that's the film that's in my mind, you know, talking about these larger than life characters that are as large as life in many ways. I love your Oscar acceptance speech. You know, I watched it again on YouTube. What was that moment like, walking up onto stage and being greeted by Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, you know, I was in the second to last category of the night. So, you know, I'd never been at the Oscars before, obviously. I just started in the movie business. And sat there, but they send a limousine for you, and everybody's going to the Oscars, you know, or a lot of people are going to the Oscars. And so you just get in a kind of endless funeral train where you sit in a limousine that moves incredibly slowly for like 2 hours or 3 hours until you finally get to the place where the Oscars are being out. And then you get out and you go in and you like do a couple of interviews on your way in or whatever. And then you sit in your chair, and I sat for 3 more hours and until your category comes up. And so you don't really have much to do beyond worry. Am I going to win or am I going to lose? And I settled on, my question really was, what do I think is going to happen? Because I know myself well enough to know that I fool myself. I don't know how I actually feel about something until it happens. And so when my name was called, I was astonished. And I realized that I had 100% prepared to lose. And so suddenly everything was different than it had been for the previous 6 hours or more, or my whole life. And so I started to walk up towards the stage. And as I walked, I just had this growing sense of out of body and incredulity. And I got up on the stage and Gregory Peck gave me a bear hug, and Audrey Hepburn handed me the Oscar and kissed me on the cheek, or I kissed her, I don't remember which. And I was like, turned around and there was every famous person I'd ever seen in my life. And I thought, and I'll always be grateful for this, a voice came into my head and said, let this in, let this good thing in. And I realized that I was incredibly defended against disappointment and pain. And that now at last I had come to a brief moment when I didn't need to protect myself. And I'll always be grateful that I remembered in time to put down my sword and my shield and let that good thing in. And I did. And I was tremendously happy and really enjoyed winning the Oscar. And I've always been grateful for that, because it's very quick, you know, and you can blow it. You can say these wooden things and be kind of checked out and, oh, well, I'm very grateful, you know, and you miss it. And then the rest of your life, you're going to know that. I've seen people do it many times when I've watched the Oscar. And I'm just very fortunate that it didn't happen to me.
That's wonderful that you're able to, as you say, let that in. I'm going to add the clip of what you said at this point in the podcast so people can hear it as well.
And the winner is John Patrick Shanley for Moonstruck. Wow. I don't care, man. I don't care if we're supposed to be cool. This is incredible. Thank you. I'd like to thank everybody who ever punched or kissed me in my life, and everybody who I ever punched or kissed. I'd like to thank Norman Jewison especially, because I would not be here if it was not for that man. I'd like to thank the multimedia princess Cher and the remarkable Nick Cage and the ensemble cast of Moonstruck, which was great. I'd like to thank my agent, Janine Edmonds. I'd like to thank my wife, Jane, for the love that she gives me. And I'd like to thank Patrick Palmer for producing the picture and Bonnie Paliff for associate producing the picture. I'm sure I'd like to thank a lot of other people, but I'm going home and die now.
And so did that let new things in for you? Because the next thing in terms of film would have been Joe versus the Volcano, an Amblin production. You're there with Kathleen Kennedy, Frank Marshall, Steven Spielberg, like the big shining lights in that part of cinema. How was that experience? And were they supportive?
They were incredibly supportive, endlessly supportive. And, you know, Steven and I talked all the time. And every time he mentioned a movie, which he did constantly, if I said I hadn't seen it, I hadn't seen practically nothing, he would send it over to my hotel and I'd watch it. And then I'd come in and I'd talk to him about it. And so, because I had no interest in directing. I had never particularly thought about it. Now, I'm going to direct this movie with typhoons and exploding volcanoes. It's kind of a crazy situation. I'm a monk from the Bronx who's like from this little neighborhood where I was, raised to be a union guy, or cop or a fireman or whatever. And, finding myself suddenly out on the Pacific Ocean on a yacht with a camera crew, or with hundreds of extras running down to the water with outrigger canoes. And I'm like, how did I get here? What is, So it was a surreal experience. And I was in a terrible struggle with Warner Brothers for at least half a year, where they wanted me to be making a different movie that I was making. I was making a very untypical Warner Brothers movie. And they were, sort of known for comedies, light comedies, and/or like Lethal Weapon kind of stuff, and very good at it. And I was doing this thing that had, I had one scene that had like a almost 2-minute long uncut master with no coverage, and they all went crazy. I mean, that was just almost provocation on my part. But I got the movie made, and I got the movie made the way that I wanted to. And I took an incredible amount of shit for it. And then over time, people started to like it.
Yeah. It's funny. I mentioned on Twitter and on a previous episode of my podcast, that I was interviewing you. And immediately people are sending me quotes from the movie, telling them that the moon scene changed the way they looked at the world. There was another one here. Somebody said, somebody called Afterglow 2046 on Twitter said, the Ozzie Davis scene in Joe versus Volcano goes through my mind at least once a month. It's just so perfect. That line, it's taken me my whole life to figure out who I am and I'm tired now, is perfect. If I was to ask John a question, do you believe you found out who you are yet?
That is an interesting question. I would say I am somebody. I am very much in my identity, but it's a different thing to be somebody, and not everybody is. I am somebody. I have a definite reaction to most things. But being able to say what that is, that's a very different thing. And I think that's, been the work of the 25 or 30 full-length plays that I've done, and 9 or 10 films that I've done, is to say what I see and what I think. It's a record of all of the preoccupations and changes that I've gone through in my life. Though, I went to a reunion a number of years ago, maybe like 15 years ago. And it was a reunion at this private school I went to in New Hampshire. And the school was only in existence for about 12 years altogether. And since I left that school, I hadn't seen any of those people again. I spent 2 years living with them on top of a mountain, so it was intense. And then I never saw any of them again until this reunion, which was like 35 years later. And I went, and all these events and stuff. And then a friend of mine from the old days was driving me back to my room, and he pulled the car over to the side of the road, and he slammed his hands down on the steering wheel, and he said, "Everybody's exactly the same." And I said, "Yeah, I know what you mean." I said, in many cases, that seems to be pretty much the truth. Right. Obviously, in my case, I'd been through a lot of stuff that I didn't expect to go through, and I've gone through like a million changes, and had it, to me, a very shocking life over and over again. And he listened, and then he said, "You're exactly the same as when you were 15. No changes of any kind." So there's a parallel tracks of people, and on one track, we are exactly the same as the person we were born. And on the other is everything that happened to us, and all of the turns in the road that we took, by choice or not. And I knew he was right. I knew that on some, which I didn't know until he said it. But when he said it, I'm like, yeah, I've always been this way. Whatever this is, I've always been this way.
That's a great answer to that question. I'm sure my listener will be very happy with that one. I was going to say about Joe versus Volcano and Moonstruck. They both remind us that we can look at the world as a magical place. In many ways, Wild Mountain Thyme is the same. It can, we are allowed to do that, and I think people get very cynical about that. Why is that important to you in your storytelling, reminding people, and maybe yourself, that the world can be magical?
Well, I mean, do you want to have fun? Do you want, or do you, there's like a million ways to have fun. There's, for instance, the sort of French attitude, which I have a lot of fun encountering, which is life is shit. And, it's like, they shrug, a great deal of shrugging, and life is shit. And then that's where the conversation starts. Yeah. And then it goes wherever it goes, because I adore the French culture. I just love encounters with the French. There's something so unpredictable for me as an American about their demeanor and their sensibility that it constantly wakes me up. And so anything that sort of wakes me up anew and pulls me out of my assumption complex makes life more magical and interesting to me. So to your point, I find significance in everything. And I challenge somebody who finds significance in nothing or very little to equal my enjoyment of being alive, because it is through meaning that one achieves a connection to all of the swirling forces that one encounters on a daily basis. If you just are thinking, yeah, this is just, it's like, well, that's just swamp gas. That's just, the aurora borealis is just ions doing such. I'm like, you are so missing the point, dude. you were furnished with these senses to allow them to let you enjoy the unbelievable show that we find ourselves parachuted into, and that we're only here for a brief spell, that we get to have this ride, this amusement park, which is life on Earth.
Yeah. Yeah, I love your answers, John. They're fantastic. You just have such a wonderful way of talking. I was thinking about watching your movies recently again and thinking about how prominently the moon has featured in your work. There's something about the moon, isn't there? It's something to do with closeness and distance and love, and how we're all connected because we can all look at the moon, and you could be on different parts of the country or different parts of a continent and you can share that moment. What does the moon mean to you? Why is it featured so many times in your work?
First of all, there's what the Germans call the Ding Han Sick, the thing in itself. So there's the moon and it moves me and I don't know why. That's where I start, right? And then I have the many, many different eras of my attitude and relationship to the moon. And probably one of the more recent ones is when I discovered that the moon is a broken off piece of the earth. And so that we're looking up at something that's broken off from us. It used to be with us, and it fled a certain distance, but it can't completely leave, nor can it return. And what more compelling image could there be for my relationship to my own soul, where it's always on this tether, where I can see it, I can feel it, I cannot completely possess it, nor does it ever utterly flee me.
You're a very inspirational man, John. I hope you know that, and I hope people tell you that as well, because you really are. I want to talk about Doubt as well. Again, another film where you appear to have captured lightning in a bottle. I mean, that cast: Meryl Streep, Philip Seymour Hoffman, Amy Adams, and Viola Davis. Oh my God, that performance is unbelievable. She's on screen for just a matter of minutes, and she's utterly captivating. I mean, it's something to do with those particular performers, that they don't ever reveal technique. Somehow they completely embody that moment. What was it like working with that cast? Was it as big a pleasure as it would seem for us on the other side?
Easy. In other words, you've hired like 4 of the greatest actors alive.
Yeah.
And you basically say, can I get you another glass of water? They're going to do it. A couple of times there was one time where I had to step in and on the shooting day, collaborate with Phil Hoffman because we'd gotten something wrong in rehearsal and how to fix it. And I had that with Viola. It was where on the day when I shot it, in Viola's case, I saw the dailies and knew that I'd made a mistake, where I'd made it that I said at the start of the scene with Viola and Meryl, I'd said to Viola, okay, you're the gas and Meryl, you're the brakes. And so you head out to do this walk and talk. And so Viola would be out in front and Meryl would be after her. And when I looked at the dailies, I went, oh, I completely screwed up, because it seems like Viola is like villainous, or that she's utterly aware of something morally wrong with her, that she's like running away from Meryl. So I reshot the scene. I didn't explain to either of the actors why. I said there was like a technical problem with sunlight, but in fact, I knew that I'd shot it the wrong way. And I did that because I was worried that that Miramax would say, no, you can't go back and reshoot the scene. We don't have the money. So I just made it like I was going to do a pickup shot. But then once I had the crew there, I'm like, no, we're not just doing a pickup. We're doing the whole scene again. Phil, we'd had choice that we made in rehearsal of him sitting behind this desk in the big confrontation with Merrill. And when we got there on the day, and Roger Deakins was lighting, and we did a rehearsal, and I looked at it, I'm like, I went over to Phil, I'm like, we're gonna have to change it. You can't stay behind the desk. And he's like, that's the way we rehearsed it. I know, it doesn't work. I just sort of looked down, it doesn't work. And then Deakins overheard it and said, yelled to the crew, okay, totally different fucking idea. Take all the lights down. He had to come out, and he did, and he was tremendous. He did a great job. So, but for the most part, you just, you're there to keep things on track. And actors also are very sensitive. And so they absorb you. You talk about, an article in the newspaper, what kind of weather there is, or your shoes being uncomfortable. The whole time, they're taking things from you that they then turn around and use when they're working. It's a subtle alchemy that's ongoing, that's underneath everything. And these folks certainly did that.
Yeah, in spades. I mean, great that you identified that moment, those moments where you knew it was not quite right, and you had the chance to tweak it.
Yeah,
I think you said it yourself about Doubt, where it's a pretty bold move to make a film where there's no cars, there's no shooting, there's no kissing, there's minimum number of characters. Obviously, it was a play that you'd written before this, but how difficult was it to find the balance in the writing, in both the theatre and in the film, to make sure that we all came out with different ideas? Because we all do. Everybody does when you watch that movie or watch that play.
It was the most difficult screenplay I've ever written, bar none. I had to come up with a different kind of solution to make it work properly. And that was, I had to micro manage the physical world that they were inhabiting, so that there were motivated camera moves 2 or 3 times a page. And I had to go, so I do it on an analytical level. In addition to, creating scenes like the nuns getting up in the morning in their gowns in the hallway, and the eating scene where the nuns are eating in funereal silence, drinking milk while the priests are boisterously drinking and smoking and eating red bloody meat. So you try to come up with stuff like that. But for the biggest job was not those scenes. It was the scenes where they aren't just in a room talking. And it's like, how do I keep that camera moving not arbitrarily? And finding those tiny events of the light bulb blowing out, or the blinds having to be closed, or the blinds having to be opened, or the telephone ringing, or the intercom going off, or a knock on the door, to keep the ballet alive.
Yeah, I think that's done so effectively. And in the same way that I said the actors in that movie never reveal their technique, your direction never reveals its technique. You have that thing with the blind, and when she opens the blind and the lights on his face, you don't see it in a kind of, there's nothing clunky about it. It feels completely natural, but it motivates as well, motivates the characters as well. The other thing I like about that movie, and I really like that movie, is that there's no nostalgia about the setting. The setting is the setting, and we buy it. We don't. I mean, I've been to the Bronx, I've been to Brooklyn, I've been all around New York, but I don't know what it was like back then. But I didn't feel at any point that, oh yeah, look, they've removed a lamppost there and they've put a car there, an old car there. I just buy it. How do you go about making an environment effective in that way? I understand, actually, didn't you have to make it look like autumn as well?
Yeah, we had to do a bit of that. That's not the hard part. But I'm from that neighborhood in the Bronx where it was set, so I've had encyclopedic knowledge of, I remember having a costume parade with Ann Roth, and I said, those shoes are wrong on the boys. They all have to say that, to have the same color shoes was a regulation. And she didn't know that. How would she know that? But those little things, like Gene O'Neill would call them the poetry of the real. That is very hard. It's very hard to beat. It's funny though, I had people see the movie who went to that school and wrote to me, called me, and saying that the principal's office looked exactly like the principal's office. And the truth is that it didn't look anything like the actual principal's office. That I was working with colors, very saturated colors, because when everybody's dressed in black, ordinarily in street clothes, you can't do that because the actors will get lost against the background. But because the actors were dressed in black, I could put like a really rich green in the principal's office, which makes a black costume pop forward, and a Virgin Mary blue background in another scene with the two nuns. And again, that same effect is going on. But the reason that they said it looks exactly like it did, is because the color is emotional. And that was how I felt in a color. And something in them recognized that, I think. And then the exteriors actually are the church school. I shot the actual, the church wouldn't let us get any closer than, 15 feet or something, but they would allow us to shoot the school. And we had the kids outside and we sort of cheated them 15 feet away from the wall of to accommodate the parameters. But it's interesting and fun to really try to honor something on a realistic level and an artistic level at the same time.
Yeah, I think, again, very effectively executed. You worked with Roger Deakins, you mentioned on that. How did that collaboration come about there? Roger, being a very very wanted individual for his skills. Was that something that came easily?
Well, it was Scott Rudin. Scott Rudin produced the film, and he's the one who got Roger Deakins. He had him on, I think, The Reader in Germany, and they had a delay, and Deakins was going crazy because he's a workaholic. And so he'd do anything to get out of Germany. And Scott said, well, if you go on doubt, I'll let you out. You can leave Germany. And so he said, and you can go back to work, So Deakins immediately agreed. I guess he read the script. And then Roger and I met in New York and hit it off. And he's not garrulous, but he's a hell of a hard worker, really fast and deeply artistic. Good guy.
Yeah, I've been listening to his podcast that he does with his other half. It's been quite entertaining. Those Dutch angles that you chose in the film, they can be controversial sometimes, Dutch angles. I work in live TV myself, and I'm an editor in live TV and a director. And some people love them, some people hate them. I think maybe people hate them because of the way it makes them feel, but then you obviously chose that for that reason.
Yeah, it is an emotional thing. It has an effect on you. I think the only people that would have an issue with the few Dutch angles that I had in the film are people who have big opinions about film, period. In other words, they're not people who are actually just watching the movie. They're people who are watching and dismantling as it goes. And then I would say those people were looking for something to quarrel with. And they found something this big, a little thing that they, Dutch angles aren't, it's not the third man. It's not a major factor in the film, but it does help to create a sense of psychological build as the film goes on.
Yeah, there's something quite unsettling about it, isn't there? Something is happening in the mind of the characters and maybe something's happening in the future. Yeah, I thought it was very effective. I really did. I like that thing you said. I think it was on the commentary for Doubt about Viola Davis's performance about nobody knows what greatness is, but you know it when you see it. And I think that kind of speaks to the whole film as well. I looked at the cover of that movie. I remember the poster being in the cinema, and I thought, do I want to see a movie? What's that going to be about? It looks dark. It looks foreboding. And my wife and I came out at the end of it, and we went for a walk for like 2 hours just talking about what I thought and what she thought. We're phoning people saying, have you seen it? What did you think? It's wonderful, really wonderful.
Well, it's a great, when we did the play, what became apparent was that the second act of the play took place after people left the theater. That people really continued to talk about the play at dinner and at home. A lot of people. I heard from a lot. I had my email in the program. And so I heard from all kinds of people and a lot of clergy, for instance. And it was, and a lot of marriages. A lot of the emails back were my wife and I are trying to settle something, or my wife and I, but it was this thing about they'd been talking about. And that, of course, was very gratifying.
Yeah. I think cinema at its best is something where we come out taking, what we get out of it is what we take into it, and it gives us that chance to kind of interpret our preconceptions. And I wanted to also talk about Wild Mountain Thyme, your latest film, which was last year. I sort of cancelled last year in my head. I think as last year as 2019 somehow, because I didn't do anything. I think I put the trash out, and that was about it. That's as far as I went. So talk to me about Wild Mountain Thyme. How did that come about? It began as a play again.
Yeah, I did. I wrote a play about my family in Ireland, in Central Ireland, in Westmeath, and they lived. And my cousin Anthony still lives on a farm outside Mullingar, and I wrote a play that was very much inspired by the family. My cousin Anthony lives on this farm outside Mullingar, and I wrote a play about him because he never married, and he was like a really handsome, really funny, very eccentric guy. And I went one time with him for a walk down the lane out in front of his farm. And I said, that we passed a couple of houses, and I said, who lives in these other places? And he said, would you like to see? And I said, sure. And he went up to the house that was adjoining his farm, and he knocked on the side door, and a woman opened the door, and she was astonishingly beautiful. And when she saw Anthony, it was like she'd been electrocuted. She was like, oh. It's like, come in, and it was clear, like Anthony showed up at a door like once a decade, if that. And we had a drink or whatever, and chatted for a little bit and left. And when we left, I said, Anthony, that woman likes you. And he said, do you think so? I'm like, gee, she practically had a heart attack. And I thought, well, this is going to be hard. I see why it's hard for this guy to get married, my family's farm had two gates that separated it from the road that were 20 feet apart. And I was like, why? That seems odd. You have to open two gates, drive through, close two every single time you enter them, and they would change the subject. They wouldn't tell me. And so that was also a provocation. So I ended up writing the play, and we did it on Broadway with Manhattan Theater Club, and it went very well. I did with Brian F. O'Byrne and Deborah Messing, and got nominated for a Tony and did good business and all of that stuff. And so my old friend of mine, Leslie O'Dang, who produced Savage and Limbo and Dreamer Examines His Pillow a million years before, resurfaced and said, I'd like to do this as a film. And it was through her dogged efforts that the financing for the film was finally put together, because nobody was financing movies like this. Small stories about, families and things like that simply weren't doing it. But we still needed, stars. And then we got Emily Blunt and Jamie Dornan and Chris Walken and John Hamm, and the whole thing came together, and off we went to Ireland and shot the film on location.
Was that shot? When was that shot? Was it pre-pandemic then?
Yeah. It was shot. We wrapped in November, and the pandemic hit in the following March.
One thing I wanted to ask you about your process as a director, and I'm aware that we're kind of an hour and 10 in here, so I'll maybe make this the last thing. I've spoken to a few editors recently. I've spoken to Paul Hirsch, who worked with Brian De Palma and George Lucas, and worked on many films. And I met Walter Murch last night, who of course worked on Apocalypse Now, and fantastic talent. He was talking about how some directors, that he's there editing and the director's here, just there looking over his shoulder. And other directors say, "I'm not coming in the editing room. That's your job," and they hand it over. How do you interact with your editors?
I would prefer to be the handed over guy and go on my merry way. I remember I saw the first assembly of Doubt that was edited by Dylan Titchener, and I wanted to kill myself. Of course, all directors want to kill themselves after they see the assembly of their film. And I said, okay, cut out this scene, and this scene in their entirety. And he looked astonished and said, and then jubilant, and said, okay, major surgery. I love it. Then after that, it was mostly fine tuning, and it was mostly Dylan. He was just, really good feel for the material and cut it really well. And with Wild Mountain Thyme, I had to be in the editing room a lot more. That was just the chemistry on that one. It was an editor named Ian Bloom. It just took a lot of work. And at a certain point, I brought in the producers and say, look, you take a whack at this, because we're still a ways away from where we need to be. And they did, and they turned out, because they had, wanted to, and I wouldn't let them. And then they did, and I looked at the result and I said, this is significantly better. So I was happy about that. I don't really care where the good news comes from, as long as there's good news. So each one's different, Joe versus the Volcano, when we did that, they actually still did it with a razor blade and Scotch tape. I mean, you'd say, make this moment, they'll cut it like 5 seconds earlier, and they say, okay, come back in 20 minutes. They couldn't do, now they just be like that. And then, no, it was minimum 20 minutes.
Yeah, I asked Walter Murch last night if he kind of still gets nostalgic for the days where when he'd made a splice, it was a definite thing and it really couldn't be undone easily, as opposed to having 20 versions on your Avid timeline. And he said both situations are a pain in the arse ultimately.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
And you can't change it. So yeah,
everything's horrible.
You're sounding French now.
Everything has everything can go wrong, no matter how you do it. Look, when I write, I wrote in longhand for a long time. Then I taught myself to write on a typewriter. And then I had to teach myself on a computer. And the switch from typing to computer is a big one. And because it's so easy to change things. And now that works really well for me. But at first, it was scarier because that shit's just gone. It just disappeared. You take that thing out, whereas with longhand, you crossed it out, you can still see it.
Yeah.
But now I love it. Working with the computer is much faster. But I don't think I could have done it early in my career.
As a very final question then, John, What's next for you? Is it back to the theatre? Is it another film project you want to work on? What's in mind for you next?
The next thing is, well, I have a new film that they're out making offers on, and we'll see. I have no idea. The financing's there if they can cast the picture. It's called The Twinkle Brothers, and it's about these two guys from Puerto Rico, brothers, who open competing restaurants in New York, and the competition is based on lighting. Who can have the more garish lighting? But the next thing that I'm planning to do is a play called Candlelight, which is a very unusual full-length play that I will probably do in November with a small theater and in New York. And then I'll do a bunch of one acts in Los Angeles in the winter, probably. I'm backed up. And I like to do things in the order that I wrote them, plays in particular. And so I have several things that I need to do.
I like that need to do. Yeah. You called Roger Deakins a workaholic, but I think there's a little bit of that in you as well, right?
Roger works harder than I
do. Thanks so much for your time, John. I do really appreciate it. And, from everybody on this side of the screen, thanks for doing what you do, because it's inspiring stuff, and, you've got a lot of fans out there. I hope you know that.
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate it. And good luck with the piece.
Thank you very much. All right. Oh, and Jim Maxwell sends his love.
Oh, yeah. And mine back to him.
I will do. All right. Thanks, John. Bye. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Same here.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with director and writer John Patrick Shanley there. Thanks to John for giving his time and for his wonderfully articulate answers. I really did enjoy that chat. Up next is Oscar-winning sound designer Gary Rydstrom talking Jurassic Park, Terminator 2, a whole bunch of stuff. There's a great episode coming your way later this month as well, August 2021. So there'll be 3 episodes this month, this being the second, the first being the Walter Murch Return to Oz, and then Gary Rydstrom will be the third and final one for August 2021. Just this week, following a prompt from a friend, I decided to see if I could get Phil Tippett, legendary animator, to come on the podcast. Now, I thought about getting Phil on before, but I kind of wanted to get to a point where I'd had some high enough profile guests so that he would see that, he wasn't wasting his time ultimately. And there does seem to be a bit of momentum now behind the podcast, so people are looking at who's been on, and I have to say I've had a pretty cool list of guests, really. I mean, I can't complain at all. Every one of them has been fantastic. But I think now, having got that 30 odd episodes under my belt, people are looking and going, okay, yeah, this seems legitimate. So I always think of multiple ways that I can approach people. But given that Phil Tippett has a new film out soon, I thought I'd just try and get in touch with him via Twitter. And after a couple of likes and retweets from you good folks, I got a direct message from Phil, or Phil's team, asking for my contact details, saying, we'll see what the team can set up. So I really hope that comes off. Watch this space, as they say. I've also been put in touch with the brilliant Alice Lowe, thanks to a colleague and big fan of the podcast, John Lyons. He's a fantastic sound designer who works with me at Formula One. And he's really enthusiastic about the podcast. I always get great feedback from John. I really do appreciate that. And yeah, he knows Alice. Alice Lowe, if you don't already know that name, she's an actor, writer, director. If you've seen Ben Wheatley's Sightseers, if you've seen Prevenge, if you've seen Garth Marenghi a few years back on TV here in the UK. If you haven't, just go and bloody see them because they're brilliant. We've had a short chat over email. And after a bit of a busy period, she's very keen to come on the podcast. She even said, your podcast looks great, right up my street. So hopefully I can fix a date with Alice soon. Other upcoming guests include Gabriel Hardman, comic and storyboard artist, editor Colin Goody. Colin edited Rogue One. He's also got a whole bunch of projects that he's done since then that we're going to talk about as well. We're chatting just this next week. And I've also got Jurassic Park animator Randy Dutra coming on. Lots more irons in the fire too. Joe Johnston is due to get back to me soon about fixing a date. Documentary maker Asif Kapadia, who made the fantastic Senna and Amy and the Diego Maradona documentaries, is keen, but he's busy right now. Gareth Edwards has said yes as well, director of Monsters, Godzilla, and of course Rogue One, but he's on a big project at the moment, so he said maybe in about a year and a half, but he's up for it as well. I'm also trying to get Ivor Powell back on around November time to talk about the release of his new movie, Finch, formerly known as BIOS, a script that he co-wrote, which has been bought by Apple and premieres on, I think, the 5th of November. The first photo, that is, was released to the public online yesterday, 13th of August 2021. So check that out as well. I'm really looking forward to seeing that, having read the script some time ago. Thanks as always for the continued support. I've lost a few patrons on patreon.com this month. I'm not sure why. I understand that people have had a tough year or two. So I don't begrudge you at all, and I appreciate the support you have given. But if you, listening now, do enjoy my work, and you know it is work, please do consider spending the price of a couple of coffees to help me produce a whole year's worth of film podcast goodness. Your support is very welcome, it's very appreciated, and it really does mean that I can focus more of my time and resources on this and, you know, make it bigger and better. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so again for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.
My father says that almost the whole world is asleep. Everybody you know, everybody you see, everybody you talk to. He says that only a few people are awake, and they live in a state of constant, total amazement.